We were completely serious about those free t-shirts, so if you want it, all you have to do is go onto iTunes, give us a rating out of 5 stars, and leave a review, and we'll randomly pick people every week to win something. So, go rate us on iTunes and win a t-shirt. It's that simple.
Studio D.
Last season, the NFL generated $13.68 billion in revenue. The average NFL team is worth $2.5 billion, with the Dallas Cowboys leading the way at $4 billion. But did you know that fantasy football is worth about $6 billion more than the NFL, with an $18.6 billion market? But where did it come from? Fantasy football can trace its origins to Oakland in 1962, when a group of businessmen created the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League, or GOPPPL for short. The rules were simple: 8 teams made up of players from the NFL. A rushing touchdown from one of your players wins you 50 cents, a passing touchdown gets you a quarter, and winning the whole league wins you $60. It would take a while for fantasy football to catch on, but with the advent of the internet, big companies like ESPN and Yahoo started to take advantage. Last year, 41 million people played fantasy football, and the creation of Daily Fantasy, where you can create a new team every week, has made it even more popular in the last few years. So how is it that fake football makes more money than the game itself? Today we talk with Applied Mathematics Major, Global Business Consultant for IBM, and my Fantasy Football League Manager, Evan Dienstman, about fantasy football and how teams and the NFL as a whole can use it to their advantage. I'm Dylan Garvin, and I'm more interested in the game outside of the game. In this simple sport that involves 1 ball, 2 end zones, and 11 players, how do you crack the code and build the perfect team? This is Dynasty. Hey, welcome to episode 5. Today we are talking about fantasy football, and we have my friend and fantasy football league manager, Evan Dienstman, coming on. Thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be here.
So, Evan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do for a living?
So currently I work at IBM as a consultant in DC. I'm on a project at the IRS doing a lot of statistical analysis. So definitely translates well to a lot of stats in fantasy football for sure.
Do you use that to your advantage when you play?
Well, I try to have fun with it and not take it too seriously, but I have been known to at times write a little script or query to figure out what player I should start in my lineup.
I feel like, though, sometimes you're right, like, you just got to have fun, because sometimes if you overthink it, like, there's just so much random
Oh, yeah, it drives you
like
crazy.
Yeah, exactly. So when did you start playing fantasy football?
Let's see. So the league we're in together, which, by the way, I crushed you this week.
You did.
Started in 2006. And it was just 4 of us, and we sort of like had no idea what we were doing. But 13 years later, or 13 seasons later, still been playing, and it's been lots of fun.
Yeah, and we have, just for you listeners out there, we have 16 teams right now, so it's pretty crazy.
It's a lot different than a 10-team league for sure.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like in smaller leagues, I'm in a slightly smaller league, and there's always, like, decent players on waivers, and you actually have, like, decisions to make on who you think's going to do well. But I feel like in our league, it's kind of like, I have to start these guys. Like, there is no one else I can start, because
it's a completely different game for sure.
Yeah, and you're starting, like, when bye weeks come, you're starting like a second string running back, and you're just hoping for a touchdown.
It's all about the 1-week trades.
Oh my gosh. So why do you think fantasy football is so popular, particularly in America?
Well, I mean, for the obvious reasons, it makes the Titans-Bills game a lot more interesting. But like I just like think sort of like a little aside, like football itself just lends itself so nicely to fantasy. Like the problem with baseball is there's so many stats, and like the problem with soccer is there's too little stats.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like this perfect marriage of like just enough stats, and obviously football itself is just so popular that like fantasy football just like works together.
When I was introducing this episode, I talked about how the fantasy football market is actually $18.6 billion and the NFL is only about $13.5 billion. So the fantasy football market is actually bigger than the NFL itself, which I think lends to what you just said. Like people actually care about the Titans and Bills because you and me are Eagles fans. And
Oh yeah, go Birds.
yeah, go Birds. So like we'll pay to see an Eagles game or like we want that in our TV package or we'll go to see a game, and that's how the NFL generates its money through TV mostly and then merchandise and then ticket sales. But with fantasy football, I'm probably going to watch, I have interest in 4 or 5 games if I really care about my team. Like you said, like I'm going to watch the Thursday night game if my opponents have any players in that game because I want to see what happens. And then as the season goes on, you kind of just get more interested because you're like, oh, like I love watching Patrick Mahomes. He's so good at fantasy football. He's so much fun to watch, but you might not have ever known that unless you played fantasy football.
Plus, you get very attached to some of your players that have been on your team for multiple years, and
Yeah.
you become pseudo Aaron Rodgers or pseudo Mark Ingram fans.
Yeah, it is crazy how people like you become fans of a team. Like I really like the Saints this year because it's almost entirely my team, and I didn't plan on that. Like I'm not a Saints fan, but it just kind of worked out, and now I find myself watching every Saints game and like actually caring about the team when I really have no reason to.
Oh, I was so distraught when Jimmy Garoppolo went down. That was I had him and Marquise Goodwin, so just together he tanked both those spots.
Yeah, and I also think the camaraderie that you get with playing with your friends or family or people from work, sports is such a powerful thing because it brings people together in ways that otherwise might be awkward or may never exist.
Yeah. No, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, like, I know a lot of my friends from school who don't really keep in touch with their high school friends, or college, I should say. And, having this fantasy football league, it's a really good medium to keep in touch with all of you from high school because it's hard.
Yeah. And like, we're all like pretty good friends. Like we get along, but outside of football, we probably wouldn't keep in touch. Like you said, not all of us. Like there's definitely a few people that I hung out with before fantasy football and have definitely always been friends with. But like you said, like it just gives you another reason to keep in touch. And that's what's so fun about it.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you think that fantasy football is luck or skill or a combination of both? And explain why using mathematics.
I would say it's definitely a combination, but it's probably like 70% luck and 30% skill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I sort of equate it to like picking stocks. Like at the end of the day, like if you dedicate your entire job, to this, you're gonna do better than average. But it's just so many variables, from like the weather to, like I think like what people forget is like the Eagles are traveling to London this week and, people are jet lagged, people, don't feel well or something, and you just don't know that, and you can't create a statistical model that captures that. So like while there's definitely stats to give you better odds, there's a lot of luck involved, and like I said, I sometimes try to not overthink things and just have fun with it.
Yeah, and I definitely think there can kind of be like an information overload because so many people are like newspapers have a lot of newspapers and websites have a writer just for fantasy sports. Like that's a job now. And you have guys like Matthew Berry who go on ESPN who really have no background in sports, but they're, they know fantasy football and they know how to talk about it. And I was talking to a friend's dad the other day who played fantasy football. He started in the 80s. And so he said they would just have to go like based on what was on national TV and just based on your own knowledge. And then to check the scores, you had to look in the newspaper.
Yeah.
And even to submit your lineups, you had to call whoever was the league manager, who was kind of like the bookie, and say, hey, here's who I'm playing this week, or here's this trade that we're doing. And it's so much harder than just clicking a few buttons and then the computer automatically puts it up for you, and then you kind of just go off of that.
Yeah, now I have a panic attack when the ESPN app is stuck at like 10 minutes in the first quarter and I'm watching the game. It's like already halftime.
And also, I think just that information, because we crave that information, that's why fantasy football is worth so much. Because really, you don't have to pay for it. Like, you could play fantasy football and not put in any money and not make any money and still have fun. But a lot of people are, for one, putting money into their league. And then because of that, they may be more inclined to put money into research or like websites, or even just going to the games. Like, I'm going to Cincinnati next week, and I was thinking about going to a Bengals game because...
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, and I'm going by myself. Like, when would I ever go to Cincinnati just to watch a Bengals game by myself, except that I really like A.J. Green and Joe Mixon because of fantasy football.
Yeah, and sort of going off of what you were saying with like how it's created such an industry, I watch on TV now, there's a former NFL player, there's a medical expert, there's like some journalist, has like writing media background, and there's some math and stats person. And it's like this weird combination of people that somehow all magically fit together in this fantasy football industry.
Mm-hmm. They have the scores at the bottom, and oftentimes you'll hear announcers kind of make references to fantasy football. Like, if a guy catches 3 touchdowns, they're probably like, oh, whoever has him on their fantasy team is probably doing well. Like, you'd never hear that 15 years ago. For one, like, it wasn't a huge thing, but also, like, it kind of was referencing gambling, which wasn't really allowed. Still kind of wasn't allowed.
Right. Well, the federal court, like, just a few months ago, like, did recognize sports gambling as, like, being legal. So I think state to state, it's still up in the air. But
okay.
I think that is definitely not 100% because of fantasy football, but a lot of fantasy football is sort of leading to this change of let's legalize sports gambling.
Mm-hmm. And it's crazy, like you said, it's a lot like the stock market. Like, it's an industry based on the inner workings of another industry, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's almost meta in a way. Like, it's just, or I guess that would be like the derivative of it.
Yeah, I mean, derivative, meta, those all work. I mean, we even joked about playing like fantasy football, where your scores depend on how well fantasy football players do.
Yeah, exactly. So it just kind of becomes this whole crazy thing that as long as like everybody's into it and you create competition out of it, it's really fun to play. So do you think it has made the NFL more successful, or is it more of a deterrent?
I think at the end of the day, the money says it all. So you have to say it's made the NFL more successful. I mean, I know like a lot of like people who are against fantasy football because, like, one, you're saying it's sort of like gambling,
mm-hmm.
and two, it distracts from the actual game. People go on Twitter and yell at their fantasy football players for not scoring, or yell at coaches for not starting a player. So there are negative aspects, but again, just at the end of the day, it's the revenue it brings in, and the amount of fans. Plus, it's just fun to play.
Yeah, and like you're saying, like, it's fun, but the worst part of fantasy football is when you have a player on your team who's playing your actual team that you root for, like Odell Beckham Jr. Playing the Eagles.
Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, and you're like, I hope he does well, but like not too well. And then like last week I had Greg Olsen who's playing the Eagles, and I was playing you, and I wasn't happy at all that he scored that touchdown, because thankfully, like, I'm enough of an Eagles fan. I was just pissed at the time. And plus, you were killing me, so it didn't really matter. But it's like things like that. You might find yourself being like, you might say out loud, like, oh, no. But in your heart, you're like, ooh, that was 12 points right there.
I mean, I definitely get very happy every time Saquon scores a touchdown. But I get even happier when it's in a blowout game that I know the Giants will lose already.
And what's crazy, too, is NFL teams have already taken notice of it. Like, I have a friend whose dad works for the Jets, and we actually talked to him on the last episode, Julian. So his dad works for the Jets, and I've talked to him about stuff, but when I first started playing fantasy football, I texted him. I was like, hey, do you think this player would be good? And he's like, I can absolutely not talk about that. Like, my job made it really clear. And I asked him to come on this show, which wasn't about fantasy football, but I was just like, hey, could you come on and talk about your job? And he's just like, no, like, I would love to. I love talking to you, but I really can't because it's just like such a secretive thing. And the NFL just doesn't want their name attached to anything. They're just being super careful about everything.
It is sort of like gambling, and you can't get anywhere near stuff like that when you actually work for the organization. So it is that kind of fine line. Is it legal? Is it not? But I would feel the same way if I worked for a sports franchise.
Yeah, and I think like it's fine for now because like in our league, what do you make if you win? Like $250?
$300 for first, and it's a $50 buy-in.
So like that's a significant amount of money, but that money isn't worth more than my job. Like I'm not gonna quit my job to really try and win this league, and I'm not gonna risk my job. Like, and obviously, like NFL players and coaches for sure aren't gonna risk their job just to win fantasy football. Like, they're not making a ton of money off of it. But I think the problem is if this escalates and becomes more and more of a thing, you could start hitting a point, like Pete Rose, players betting on their own thing. And the problem with that, which has always been an issue, but just with the ease of it, maybe there's an assistant coach, like a really low-level person in the industry who may use something to their advantage, and maybe that could cost their team a win, like saying, hey, like this guy's injured. And, if that leaks out, then the other team knows, and all of a sudden their team's compromised, and that person deserves to get fired because they put fantasy football before their job.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's definitely a slippery slope, and all we can hope is that the technologies or laws and legislation around it are good enough to prevent stuff like that, because that could definitely, ruin the industry forever.
So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and play Fake or Not Player, and then talk about how NFL teams can use fantasy football to their advantage. This show is made possible by Studio D. So if you want to make your own podcast or need help with anything audio related, go to studiod.co. That's studio.co. Making a podcast is a lot easier than you may think, and Studio D has the tools to help. All right, welcome back. So first thing first, we are going to do Fake or Not Player. I explained the rules to Evan beforehand, but for those who are new to this show, I will say 10 players, and they are either a current NFL player or they're just completely fake, made-up name I picked. So you get a point if you can guess if they're real or not, and if they're real, you can get a point for guessing their team and their position, and we have a long-standing competition. I believe Julian is in first right now. So, Evan, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right. Number 1, DeAndre Hopkins.
Well, that's easy. He's a real player,
Point.
Wide receiver.
Point.
For the Houston Texans.
3 points. Number 2, Spencer Ware.
Real player.
Point.
Running back. For the Kansas City Chiefs still?
Yes, 6 points.
Where you got traded or something.
Number 3, Jamal Crawford.
Feels like it's a generic name. It can go either way. I'm going to say fake.
Yes. He is a real person. He's actually a basketball player.
Okay, I was going to say baseball, but...
All right, number 4, Bobby Wagner.
Another real person. I'm going to say real football player.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a safety?
No. Can you guess his team? He's a middle linebacker.
Middle linebacker. Guess I'll just take a guess then for the Los Angeles Rams.
No, for the Seahawks.
That's right.
He was the Super Bowl MVP when they played the Broncos.
Yeah, those defensive players really get me.
All right, so you're at 8 points. Number 5, David DeCastro.
Fake?
He is real. I'll say this is probably the hardest one.
I guess I can still guess the position and team.
Mm-hmm.
All right. David. That's a sounds like a defensive lineman name.
No, he's a guard.
Well, I'll just guess the team then. The Jets?
No, the Steelers.
Like
whatever. I said, that was pretty hard. All right, number 6, Fletcher Cox.
Oh, that's easy. He's a real football player.
Points.
Plays for the Philadelphia Eagles.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have to get like specific, like the defensive position. Can I just say like defensive lineman?
Yeah, I mean he plays
Okay.
both end and tackle.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
So that's good?
Yeah, you're good. You are at 11 points.
Go Birds.
Number 7, Jason Flemings.
We haven't had a fake one yet. I'm going to go fake.
Points.
All right.
Number 8, Bruce Meyerson.
Could be like a kicker name or a punter name. I'm going to say real.
Also fake.
Darn.
Number 9, Harrison Smith.
Just generic name again. I think maybe 1 and 2, 3 fakes in a row. So because of that, I'm going to say fake.
No, he is real.
Not doing well. All right. What was the name again?
Harrison Smith. He's a real player.
I'm going to go punter for that.
No, he is a safety.
All right. 1 and 32 shot here. Gonna go with the Cardinals.
Vikings.
Same conference. I mean, it's pretty close.
And last one, Teddy Bridgewater.
Real.
Point.
Quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And plays for the Saints.
Nice.
Well, he's a backup quarterback, so doesn't really play.
I figured his name was for a third-string quarterback or second-string quarterback. Pretty well known, which is crazy.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Evan, you got 15 points, which...
Respectable.
Very respectful. I don't remember off the top of my head what Julian got, but I think he got a little more than that because he was going crazy and got like every single one.
I just want to be above the 50th percentile. That's the goal.
I think you're good. So, for the last segment of our show, we wanted to talk about how fantasy football lends itself to the NFL and how they can take advantage of it. So my first question to you is, how can the NFL capitalize on fantasy football?
It's sort of like the infrastructure around fantasy football is almost the same for actual football. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're talking about like television shows and stats and information. I mean, it's really just a matter of previewing each game and maybe you put a little twist on it for fantasy football, but for actual football, you just sort of talk about like who's going to win the game versus which player is going to do well.
Yeah.
So I think like that's one of the biggest benefits for the NFL, and I guess beyond that, I don't know, how can they capitalize? I mean, just continuing. I mean, I guess they don't want to really promote gambling and stuff, but if they sort of gear towards that, they can sort of grow both industries together.
Yeah, and you kind of already see that they've created their own fantasy football platform on NFL.com. So they are invested in it. Like you said, they don't really want to promote gambling, but at the same time, they do want their money because without the NFL, there's no fantasy football. So I think they've recognized that, and they are definitely more aware of like, hey, like, we should be the ones to take advantage of it, because if we just ignore it, then other people are going to make money. So like they're going to do it no matter what, and we aren't going to be able to stop it.
Yep, that's pretty much like it's like prohibition. You take away our alcohol and everyone gets mad. You take away our fantasy football, everyone's going to get mad. So it's here to stay for sure.
Yeah, and I think more than that, you even see the NFL has become more of an offensive league, and I think I would imagine fantasy football has to have an effect on that. Like, besides the fact that people want to see more exciting, high-score games, like, naturally people want to see that. So they've already been trending that way. But also, people, like, when I watch the Bills-Titans game and it ends 3-9, that sucks.
Yeah.
Like, not only was it quote unquote a
Yeah.
boring game because people like offense. It could have been an awesome defensive game, but most people don't care for that. But it's a boring game because, Derrick Henry got 27 yards and he's on my team and I wanted to see him do well. So
Yeah.
even if the game's crappy, like people will still watch garbage time because they have players in, and a catch is worth a point in our league. So when if the Vikings go down by 40 to the Saints, I want to see if Stephon Diggs gets 12 catches. So there is that investment there, just gearing the game and understanding why people are watching and how we can get them to watch longer and to watch more than just their home team game.
Yeah, no, definitely few comments there. I think I agree with you. It's a lot more offensive today. I will say it's partially because of player safety. You just can't make the tackles that you
Mm-hmm.
used to, which it generally helps the offensive players. Um, and then definitely the garbage time scoring. I know my girlfriend's like, this game's over. Can we do something else? And I'm like, no, Saquon Barkley has 99 receiving yards. If he just gets one more, you can get 100 plus bonus in rushing and receiving.
You would never care about that, 10 years ago or if you
Right,
weren't playing.
right.
But all of a sudden, it's this really exciting thing. And that's kind of what sports is in a nutshell, too. Like, technically, sports don't really matter, technically. Um,
What? You mean it's not the sole purpose and meaning of life?
exactly. No, like, there are times where sports transcend just the sport itself and their social impact. But for the most part, the result of especially regular season games, like I always think of like you said, like if Eagles lost on Sunday and that was really hard, like it was such a
Oh,
tough way for them to lose. But
ruins your whole week.
yeah, but if you let it ruin your week, you're missing out on other stuff, which is hard,
That's true.
because you're
Yeah.
invested. Like you've lived in Philadelphia. Like I said, it transcends more than just the game. It's that I live in Philly. I want where I live to do well. I put my heart and soul into this. I want to see this team do well because I think those players deserve it because I'm a fan of them. And that definitely matters. But I guess I was saying fantasy football is kind of the same thing. Like you're just creating a sense of value in it by making it exciting.
Yeah. The more fun, the better. I mean, it's just what we're all trying to do. Is have fun.
We talked about the NFL taking advantage. How can specific teams take advantage? And I'll just start first. Like we said, like there's definitely more offense, and I think teams recognize that, so they're prioritizing, the quarterback instead of our cornerback, or instead of like a defensive player. And actually, because offense is king, they're also drafting defensive backs because they're like, we need really good defensive backs because it's not as easy anymore. So we need top of the line guys if we're ever going to compete. But it's just the way it's trending. I think coaches are recognizing that, hey, this slow pace might have worked a few years ago, but really I need to start gearing up to pass the ball 40 times. And I need to make sure that my players are prepared for that and that we draft players who are capable of that. Our running backs can catch the ball instead of just running it. That we have lots of people that we can run a fast pace and that everybody's conditioned. There's no out of shape players. So I think just generating a game plan that's based on more offense because of fantasy football, because of that rooted interest, is definitely important if a team wants to win the Super Bowl. And one thing I've noticed is teams that win the Super Bowl often have good fantasy football players. Like it's been a while since we've seen a team win that didn't have those star players that people were rooting for.
Joe Flacco.
Yeah, I think back to really
I
like
mean, he is elite though. So
yeah, but I mean that year he did well, but like really the best players on those teams were Torrey Smith and even the team they were playing, Colin Kaepernick, and I guess Frank Gore was still on the 49ers at that point. But really, like, there was no Odell Beckham Jr., there was no Tom
yeah,
Brady, there was no Alvin Kamara. Like, there was no super exciting player there. And that was really the outlier. Like, I think recently, especially like last year, like the Eagles had some great fantasy football players. The Patriots always do. So it's just that if you want to win, you do need to have those star players.
I agree definitely with everything you said, and just sort of going off of that, I mean, the one big thing that teams can capitalize on is that just the wealth of information that we collect for fantasy football. And, you can sort of moneyball your team now by just going on to like any NFL database and having tons and tons of records being like, okay, the past 10 teams that won the Super Bowl, what was their like quarterback ranking in, receiving yards or throwing yards, and what, how many completions do they have? What was their quarterback rating? And you can just basically use all of this to be like, all right, what direction is the NFL going? How do I build my team to sort of continue that trend or even get ahead of the trend?
Yeah, well said. So last question, where do you think fantasy football will be in 25 years?
Hopefully still around. I envision our fantasy football league going on until we're in our retirement home. But going back to some of the points we touched on already, I think the world and America will be going towards sports gambling, and I think because of that, it's going to help the fantasy industry. You're definitely going to see a lot more television, covering fantasy sports, more and more media coverage on websites and whatnot. So yeah, I only think it's going to continue to grow, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
So if you're going to build a dynasty, you need to pay attention to the culture around you. Teams that win the Super Bowl also have players that do well in fantasy. So maybe you do invest in those star players, looking at you Steelers, and accept that the NFL is turning into an offensive league. Dynasty is produced by Studio D, and if you like what you heard, go back and listen to our previous episodes this season. You can also check out Season 1 if you missed it. It's about the NBA.
You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at this_is_dynasty and find our episodes anywhere you get your podcasts. If you want more, please leave us a review on iTunes and tell your friends.
Studio D.
Great development, we can have further development, the opportunities for young men. No limit today is the word. A few years ago, I think so. Yes, indeed. If the young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do.
Basement Dwellers is a new podcast about alcohol, cars, being young, and not knowing what to do with your life. Hosts Tyler Luther and Zach Woods talk with friends, businessmen, and people with interesting jobs. That's Basement Dwellers, an original Studio D podcast.